Good evening, everybody. My name is David Goodman. I'm the Director of the China Studies Centre here at the University of Sydney. Before we start, may we acknowledge that the University of Sydney is on land that was never ceded, that we recognise the existence and rights of its traditional owners to land, sea and air, and we respect their elders and their traditions and customs. Today we have a visitor from the United States, Tony Saich, who's actually staying with the China Studies Centre in Sydney for a few months. And he's going to talk about the US-China relations under an unpredictable presidency. His discussant will be David Smith from the Department of Government. Before I hand over to David Smith to introduce Tony and to act as discussant and moderator, can I suggest that if you have questions you wish to ask, you put them in the Q&A function on the bottom of the Zoom page at the bottom of your screen. Q&A, it's marked, and if you put the questions in there, later on David Smith will read them out. Okay, and without further ado, over to David Smith.
Thank you very much, David. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Tony Saich, who is someone who will already be quite well known to many of you. He's the director of the Rajawali Foundation Institute for Asia and also the Daewoo Professor of International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School. He's also a guest professor at the School of Public Policy and Management at Tsinghua University in China, and he advises a wide range of government, private and non-profit organisations on work in China and elsewhere. He was a trustee member of the National Committee on US-China Relations from 2014 to 2020. He's a board member of AMC Entertainment and International Bridges to Justice and was the chair of the China Medical Board from 2015 to 2019. He's also been a representative of the Ford Foundation's China office, and he was the director of the Sinological Institute at Leiden University in the Netherlands. Currently, his research focuses on politics and government in post-Mao China and on philanthropy in China. His most recent books, and his output puts most of us to shame, is From Rebel to Ruler, 100 Years of the Chinese Communist Party, Finding Allies and Making Revolution, the Early Years of the Chinese Communist Party, and the 5th edition forthcoming of Government and Politics of China, Institutional Change and Adaptive Efficiency. So without further ado, we're going to hand over to Tony Saich, who is going to give us his thoughts on an unpredictable presidency for the next 30 or 35 minutes. I will come back at about 6:40 to ask some questions of Tony in order to get the discussion going, and then we will open the floor up to everyone. So, Tony, please take it away.
Yes, thank you, David. First of all, let me thank the Centre for the invitation to visit here, especially as it's enabled me to avoid 2 or 3 of the worst months of winter back in Boston. So I'm very grateful for that. Well, with the unpredictability of President Trump, it's quite likely that anything I'm going to say today could be undermined by tomorrow with a few tweets from the president. But anyway, let me give it a go. Now, before the election, online there was the use of a phrase drawn from a classical Chinese novel. All crows under heaven are the same black, it said. Now, in terms of the tensions between the US and China, that may well have been true. However, I think there's a significant difference. A Harris victory would have provided a stable environment for the Chinese leadership to respond to. It wouldn't have been necessarily less tough. But of course, Trump's victory has already revealed the challenge for the Beijing leadership of how to deal with such an unpredictable president. Now, the election in the US was fought primarily on domestic issues. Global issues didn't really feature very much, except for comments from President Trump about tariffs on China and ending wars. But the global consequences of his election are already clearly apparent. We see the reduction in the engagement of public goods provision, withdrawal from WHO, Paris Climate Agreement, and the curtailing of most of USAID's activities and programs. The strengthened sovereignty claims that disrupt the existing international order, claims for Greenland, comments on the future of Gaza, etc. And of course, economically, there's been disruption with his use of tariffs to combat anything he dislikes. But I do think his views did tap into a vein of discontent amongst some in the United States. There was the sense that other countries were free riding on US largesse. So, for example, we see with Trump's call for other nations to contribute more to defense expenditures. I think there was a growing decline in the faith in international institutions, United Nations and the ICC. I think there was a tiredness with global responsibilities that they felt America was taking on. And of course, there was very strongly the aversion to overseas conflicts that many saw as irrelevant to America's own interests. So the key question, of course, to the US-China relationship is which Donald Trump is going to turn up. Is it going to be the deal maker whose threats seek to apply pressure to get more favorable terms, or will it be a president who wants to ensure that the US remains the number one and China's development and his development capabilities are really stalled? Or will it be both on different issues at different times? And given Trump's approach to leadership with his spontaneous gestures and his professed admiration of Xi Jinping, it's unlikely, or at least I think it will take some time before we see a coherent, integrated plan on how to deal with China actually emerging. I think his eclectic approach, of course, is shown very clearly by his shifting view about the sale of TikTok. In his first administration, President Trump sought to ban TikTok by executive order. However, as the ban began to approach at the beginning of this year, Trump hoped to stave off the ban. Waltz, the national security advisor, told Fox News that the administration would indeed find a way to preserve TikTok while protecting people's data. And of course, it now has 90 days to try and come to some kind of resolution on this issue. I think that was driven by three different factors. I think first, Trump noted the support it had generated from young voters for his candidacy. So now he thinks it's actually a good thing. Secondly, his relationship and support from the TikTok CEO, who of course was a privileged guest at the inauguration. And thirdly, I think is quite remarkable that nobody now wants to take ownership of the overwhelming decision to actually ban TikTok. I think the vote was 99-0, but both Democrats and Republicans now don't really want to take on that it was their responsibility to ban a popular app that had some 170 million users. Now, despite what I said, I will try and cover four issues. What might a general strategy entail? Secondly, the role of tariffs. Thirdly, the question of Taiwan. And fourth, even though this was a Biden phrase, the question of a small yard and high fence. I think we can glean possible approaches to China from four different sources. First of all, of course, his proposed appointments, a number of which have already gone through, actions taken in his first term as president, his comments during the campaign and subsequently since taking over the position, and I think analyses by aligned think tanks. Certainly, if we just look at his proposed appointees, all are extremely hostile to China. I don't think it's worth using the phrase a China hawk anymore because basically in Washington, everybody's a China hawk. We're just looking at what kind of hawk we're thinking about. But of course, as I said, those appointees have all been very tough in their views on China. But then there's the possible counterweight, of course, with the interests of those such as Elon Musk in China, where the majority of his vehicles are produced, and also a number of the business and financial leaders who've been wary about rupturing the relationship with China and have been concerned about tariffs. However, on December 15th, Trump's team, just even before he took power, insisted that he would not budge on tariffs. So the approach from President Trump's supporters, including right-wing think tanks, I think have been pretty consistent since his first administration. And if anything, attitudes have hardened in preparation for the second administration. And I see degrees of continuity between the Heritage Foundation report, which was written for the incoming administration, together with a very influential report that was written by Tariffs and Blackwell that predated his first administration. Although there are a couple of significant differences, which I'll point out in a moment. Both those reports confirm that the important policy shift is really to balancing the rise of China's power rather than continuing to assist its ascendancy. Both reports conclude that US efforts to integrate China into the liberal international order have generated new threats to US primacy in Asia. And this now is really the common refrain across Washington, as I said, irrespective of one's political affiliation. Mersheimer's realist approach, commenting that engaging China was possibly the worst strategic blunder, I think has become a fairly standard evaluation. So to counter the rise of China as it's perceived, both reports propose revitalizing the US economy and strengthening its military, supporting the creation of a tougher technology control regime, and the Heritage Report talks about implementing effective cyber policies to counteract Xi Jinping's big data ambitions, ensuring reliable semiconductor supply chains, although as I'll come back to, Trump's threats of tariffs on Taiwan could undermine that, and enhancing regional stability. Telles and Blackwell are explicit, or were explicit, about the need to reinforce the Indo-Pacific partnerships, whereas the Heritage more recent report is rather less specific on that particular aspect, perhaps reflecting President Trump's ambivalence about such arrangements. But I think there are important differences which show the evolution of Republican policy from Trump's initial administration. First, the Heritage Foundation report calls for the limited use of tariffs and non-tariff barriers. That does not appear in the reports and a build-up for his first administration. Second, the Heritage report, not surprisingly, is more explicit about the need for reshoring, restricting outbound investment into China, and expanding export controls. Thirdly, the Heritage report rejects the transition to an economy driven by green technologies. We know, of course, is something Trump has been upset about, but I think their argumentation is interesting. They say they oppose the transition to the economy driven by green technology as they feel that those are being dominated by China, and that would be playing into China's hands in the green technology space. So not surprisingly, therefore, Heritage also stresses reversing the explosion, their word, in business regulation, seeing ESG guidelines as a particular barrier to development. Fourth, and I'll come back to this later, the Heritage report does express much stronger views about the need to support Taiwan and to continue support for Taiwan. So having made those sort of general introductions, let me focus then on three more specific issues. The first is the role of tariffs, much beloved, of course, by President Trump. And as we know, in the pre-election period, Trump stressed a number of times that he would impose 60% tariffs on China. It was actually very unclear whether that included the existing tariffs, including those imposed by the Biden administration, or whether these would be a new batch of tariffs. But it was a headline number that he quoted on a number of different occasions. And as we know, to date, such a drastic move has not yet been brought in. Indeed, when he was speaking at Davos at the World Economic Forum, apart from shocking people about what would happen if they don't invest in America, he did state that we would look forward to doing very well with China and getting along. And elsewhere, he's actually said that he preferred not to use tariffs. However, as we do know, he has already introduced 10% tariffs on China, which he links to his accusations about Chinese companies being involved in the productions of the materials necessary for fentanyl. And that's his claim for why he could put the 10% tariff onto Chinese goods coming into the country. He did give a week grace for that. They actually had set up a phone call between President Trump and General Secretary Xi Jinping. But of course, once China responded with its own threat of tariffs, that call got cancelled. And some of Trump's initial outreach to Xi Jinping doesn't seem to have gone too far. Of course, as you know, he invited General Secretary Xi Jinping to attend the inauguration. That was impossible. He was going to come. It would have been incredibly difficult for Xi to come to America. But instead, he sent his vice president, Han Zheng. What I heard from administration folk in Washington was that they weren't very happy with that. They thought that Han Zheng was a lightweight and really wouldn't carry much persuasion in terms of relationships with China and between China and the United States of America. Trump's team had been pushing actually for China to send Saich, who is very close to Xi Jinping and would have been a much weightier figure. But again, I think that would have given too much credibility to the new administration coming in and was something that Beijing resisted despite quite strong overtures from Washington to have him come. Anyway, coming back to the question of tariffs, as we know, following the 10% tariffs he produced on China, in light of that and other pending threats, China's response, I think, has been reasonably measured, one might say, although it has put in its own imposition of 10 to 15% tariffs, which have now come into effect. And that did cause, as I said earlier, the proposed phone call between the two leaders at least to be postponed, if not cancelled. And Beijing, before implementing those tariffs, had actually called on Washington to enter into negotiations and to meet China halfway. So we have 10% on crude oil, agricultural machinery, pickup trucks, and some sports cars, and then 15% on US coal and liquefied natural gas. In addition, Beijing has added 2 entities to its unreliability list. One of those is the holding company for Calvin Klein and Tommy Hilfiger, and the other one is the biotech firm Illumina. It's filed a complaint with the WTO dispute settlement, of course, which is useless because the US has continually held up the appointment of the appropriate officials to oversee the dispute settlement process. But it's a signal, even though it's useless. One thing that will happen is that the US will drop the permanent normal trading relations or status with China. That was passed in the year 2000 and paved the way for China's entry into WTO because it's already been recommended by a partisan congressional committee. And that means obviously China will lose, if it hasn't already lost, access at a preferential rate for a range of its goods, although much of it is moot because of various tariffs that have been put in the meantime. Well, a 60% tariff would, without doubt, have an impact on the Chinese economy, despite its various attempts to protect itself and to isolate itself more effectively from what it sees as potential exploitation by the United States and the West more generally. A study by UBS estimated that if a 60% tariff across the board came in, it could reduce China's GDP by as much as 1.5%. For the US, though, the volume of imports from China has actually dropped quite significantly since the end of the administration. And so the income from tariffs actually has eroded quite significantly. And China is better prepared this time around and has redirected its trade quite significantly. However, there's a challenge here for China in that a significant continued redirection of exports, especially if they devalue the currency or if the currency doesn't become devalued, is liable to prove quite difficult as other countries become concerned about the influx of cheaper Chinese products that may damage their own domestic industries. And if other countries put up trade barriers, this, of course, is going to reduce China's space for action to offset potential impact of any tariffs introduced by President Trump. Already last year, the European Union introduced tariffs up to 43.5% on Chinese-made electric vehicles because of what they claimed were unfair subsidies. And that's led to negotiations between the European Union and China in the hope that China would offer electric vehicles within the EU at a minimum price. It may be worth a gamble if the tensions in the United States of America continue on a downward slope. The other challenge, though, is that many other countries are now viewing manufacturing as a way forward for their own economies, and the influx there of cheap Chinese goods is not necessarily welcome. For example, in Thailand, since 2023, I read that Thailand has seen 1,700 factories closing following a surge in Chinese imports. And also overall, since the start of 2022, developing countries, I'm not talking about America and the West, developing countries have implemented around 250 trade defensive measures to counteract Chinese imports. Those measures have included tariffs, anti-dumping investigations, and anti-subsidy probes. I think what is interesting is that even such a close ally as Brazil has actually initiated over 120 of those 250 trade defensive measures. So China's actions are harming what it sees as friends and enemies alike. And of course, as I said, any devaluation of the Chinese currency would only worsen the situation. Also, as I'll come back to later, the focus on new technologies and green technologies with the massive subsidies is also going to unleash a deluge of cheaper products into many of the countries around the world. So the next topic I wanted to touch on then is the question of Taiwan. Key appointees, advisors, right-wing think tanks all see support for Taiwan as actually crucial. Waltz, the National Security Advisor, has stated that President Trump would maintain strategic ambiguity. One might say that much of what President Trump says is strategic ambiguity, but in this case, it has a very specific meaning with relationship to Taiwan, and he would prevent conflict by demonstrating US strength. The Heritage Foundation, as I mentioned earlier, sees support for Taiwan as essential for both its own sake, but also to protect American interests in the Pacific. For them, actions should include upgrading the Taiwan military forces, deepening economic ties, negotiating a free trade agreement, and enhancing regional stability in Northeast Asia. And it's certainly the case that in the first administration, President Trump oversaw a significant increase in arms sales to Taiwan, although some claim that Taiwan was purchasing, for political reasons, arms that weren't particularly useful or necessary for their defense, but also as an increase as well in diplomatic activity. In October last year, Trump told the Wall Street Journal editorial board that he would respond to a Chinese invasion of Taiwan by, guess what? Surprise, surprise, imposing tariffs. And he mentioned that those could amount to 200%. And he threatened a rupture in trade, thus rendering military force unnecessary, he claimed. On another occasion, excuse my language now, but this is Trump's language. On another occasion, he claimed that Xi would not invade as he respected Trump and he knows that I am fucking crazy. Yet, Trump has also expressed ambivalence about Taiwan and his value to the United States. And some have wondered whether he might see it as a valuable bargaining chip in the relationship with China. His best buddy, but one wonders for how long, it's very difficult to always have two suns in the sky, Elon Musk, has described Taiwan as China's equivalent of Hawaii, indicating that it should be perhaps under mainland China's control. Coming back to President Trump, he has called on Taiwan to pay more for its own defense, a call which, of course, he's made for other allies. And again, last year, he stated that we're not different than an insurance company. Taiwan doesn't give us anything. Consequently, he called on Taiwan to raise its military spending to at least 10% of GDP. Now, that's, of course, absolutely impossible. Currently, spending accounts for 2.45% in Taiwan, slightly lower than South Korea at 2.7%, and Singapore at 2.8%. So maybe, and it's this is a wrestle within Taiwan, given the kind of political stalemate there about how much spending on defense can be increased. And I think it's something that has to be sold by the Taiwanese administration under Lai Ching-te to the public, that it is actually necessary in order also to maintain decent relations with the United States. Second, of course, Trump has accused Taiwan of stealing the American semiconductor business. Chip making on Taiwan accounts for about 15% of its GDP. And third, consequently, Trump has actually said he would impose a tariff on chips coming in from Taiwan, presumably on top of the 20% tariff that he states would be imposed on all goods globally, and the recent, 25% on steel and aluminium. But the global impact of that would be massive. Taiwan accounts for something like 68% of all global chip production, and possibly 90% of the most advanced chips. And of course, one of the things TSMC has been doing to mitigate actions against it is funding a major production facility within Arizona in the United States of America. Although one of its complaints is there's just not enough engineers to be able to staff that facility effectively. But were that to actually happen, I think there would be a howl of pain from American companies such as Apple, NVIDIA, and many others, because they would receive a very significant blow at the time. So the third topic that I want to touch on is this small yard, high fence. I don't think it really mattered who won the election. The yard was going to get bigger and the fence was going to get higher. Both nations are investing heavily, China even more so, in the technologies of the future. There is a clear recognition that the nation that controls these technologies will have enormous geopolitical influence in addition to the economic benefits. I think China has looked at history, at the United States, even at my own homeland of Great Britain. I always used to be very pleased when I traveled the world and saw the 3-pin plug in use as an example of our dominance of the global stage. And clearly China has seen that those companies that control, those countries that really control the standards for the technologies of the future will accumulate extreme and enormous geopolitical power. And that was clearly recognized by the Biden administration when on October 7, 2022, the Bureau of Industry and Security made a regulatory filing that set new extraterritorial limits on exports to China of advanced semiconductors, chip-making equipment, and supercomputer components. The intention of the Biden administration was clearly to thwart China's capabilities in certain fundamental industries that were developing those technologies of the future. It was intended to impede and hamper progress in e-commerce, autonomous vehicles, cybersecurity, and medical imaging, amongst a number of others. So my view is that intent was not just to target specific products, but rather to undermine entire industries. Japan, the Netherlands, joined the US approach, with South Korea given a one-year reprieve. And on the first anniversary in October 2023, new measures were introduced to close loopholes to prevent use in the field of AI that might strengthen the Chinese military, including chip-making tools. So the Trump administration, I think, is clearly going to continue with this approach. And the key question, again, comes back to the one I raised at the beginning, is what is the ultimate intention of his policy? Will it be to compel China to make specific changes in its industrial policy and negotiate? Or is it intended to challenge the viability of China's economic system more broadly? If needed, Washington actually has other measures it could adopt to impact key industries in China, such as airplanes, key operating systems, and rockets. For example, the Chinese biopharmaceutical industry is highly dependent on US intellectual property. China's capacity to respond is limited, and several possible measures could be detrimental to its own interests. And of course, this is why we've seen since Xi Jinping introduced the Made in China 2025, it's trying to inoculate itself against possibilities of threats from outside and to try and produce what it needs domestically. To some extent, it's been fairly successful with that. But even in the latest version of one of the self-driving electric vehicles, a number of the key components are actually US products. And so it clearly hasn't got all the way down the line with that. But it's something, obviously, it sees as a danger and is pursuing. What the measures do, though, is push decoupling in the technological sphere forward. Now, decoupling in a number of areas is not going to be possible. Trade will diminish. Foreign direct investment, of course, is diminishing. The financial sector is difficult to decouple. It's something like $5 trillion worth of engagement between the two countries. But technology is the one sphere where I think decoupling really is being pushed forward and will push forward further. So while most nations in the region, and indeed actually even further afield, do not want to be forced to choose between the United States and China, in the realm of technology, that might not be feasible. It will not be possible, or at least it'll be very cumbersome and expensive, to operate one system based on Western technologies and another based on those of China. Some concluding comments. Certain of Trump's actions may be well considered as beneficial for China. One phrase that appeared online was Trump, builder of our nation. And the implication there was that his policies would sow chaos with the United States of America and weaken America's standing internationally. Just to give three quick examples, I alluded to them at the very beginning. First is the withdrawal from WHO, the Paris Climate Agreement, and threats to withdraw from the World Trading Organization do provide China with the opportunity to stake a claim to global leadership as it moves to fill in gaps left by United States withdrawal. Secondly, the threat of tariffs on neighbors in the European Union and his seeming lack of interest in regional security arrangements may open a path for China to exploit tensions and promote its own interests. That's where I think it'll be interesting to see what happens with the European Union-China negotiations over the questions of tariffs on electric vehicles and whether the European Union moves, or whether China moves to accommodate the European Union in that area. And then thirdly, of course, there's his aggressive territorial claims. As far as I know, he hasn't yet claimed Australia, but he has talked about Greenland. We now have the Gulf of America. I noticed Google Maps just changed. If you're in the United, I don't know, I haven't looked at it in Australia, but if you're in the United States now, it does actually appear as the Gulf of America, no longer as the Gulf of Mexico on Google Maps. And then, of course, there's what he's been proclaiming for Gaza and others. So even if they're not realized, I think it will strengthen the legitimacy of China's own claims to recover, their phrase, Taiwan. So is any collaboration possible? Well, neither nation is going to collaborate unless it can define the actions as being in the national interest. And here I divide things into three categories of global public goods that could benefit from cooperation. Whether they do or not, that's a different issue. First, there's what I call the global commons. Climate change is one obvious example, but of course, President Trump is a climate change denier, has withdrawn from the Paris Agreement, and that certainly could limit cooperation. But there are other areas around oceans, water shortages. Secondly, there's what I would call global engagement, fighting pandemics, but again, the fallout from COVID might hinder this. Peacekeeping, I think certainly there would be a joint interest in preventing high seas piracy. And as far as I'm aware, there have been cooperations between China and the US to prevent some of the piracy on the seas. And then thirdly, there's the question of global regulation. Financial regulation covering cross-border settlements would be important and beneficial. Regulation on the use of AI in military contexts, for example. But I noticed that the US did not sign on to the recent meetings, I think it was in France, around AI ethics and so forth. So President Trump does like the grand bargain. And some have suggested that a China deal might appeal to him and place him alongside Nixon as someone who's really shifted the whole framework of the relationship. There are a couple of areas where agreement might be broached. 2023, the US trade deficit was at $252 billion US dollars. What is often forgotten in that is that US exports to China are almost $200 billion, only behind Canada and Mexico. So it might be possible to link tariffs to the level of Chinese investment in the US, for example, in addition to thinking about tariffs in terms of the multiple trading. But tariffs might be linked, or reduction of tariffs could be linked possibly to Chinese investment with the United States, particularly if it were to develop greenfield sites. And Chinese investment, FDI, into the US has dropped by about 97%. It's almost shut off since 2016. If one wanted to get back to those levels, you'd need about $35 billion in new investments. Is that something that Trump might want to push for, that the Chinese might be willing, at least on paper, to accede to? Another area is with the People's Bank of China. It's reduced its holdings of the US Treasury debt by 1/3. It's been shifting that money into gold. Could an agreement, for example, redirect that money away from gold and back to the US Treasury debt? For the US, it would have significant benefits because it would also keep interest rates low, which is something that President Trump has stressed he wants to bring about. And I think it would also negate the rumors, although I think they would be very hard to actually put into practice, to negate global de-dollarization or the rise of a BRICS currency, which I think is a non-starter anyway. The question there, though, is whether geopolitics and the current state of tensions will undermine that, and especially whether it might be undermined by the question around the status of Taiwan. And let me leave my comments there. Back to you, David.
Thank you so much for that, Tony. You have given us a huge amount to think about, and I'm sure a lot of people have questions. So can I remind everybody, if you've got questions, please put them in the Q&A box, and I will try to get to as many of them as possible. And before I give my own comments, I just want to pick up on one of the last things that you said about a BRICS currency. Donald Trump is the only person I'm aware of who took the possibility of a BRICS currency seriously at all. And for those of you who are not aware of how he responded, It was with a very angry social media post saying that if BRICS dares to threaten the supremacy of the almighty US dollar, he will put 200% tariffs on BRICS nations. Unfortunately, he apparently thinks that Spain is a BRICS nation. So Spain could be in for some very heavy tariffs if that were ever to come about, but of course it won't. One of the reflections I was having as you were talking, and going right back to what you said at the beginning about how a Harris victory would have presented a picture of relative stability. And I was thinking about two of the big questions that you were looking at, which were Taiwan and the question of the small yard and a high fence. And certainly, I think there was a major contrast between Biden's approach and Trump's approach, even if you could call both of them hawkish. With the Biden administration, it just seemed there was no question that if it ever came to war in Taiwan, the US would directly militarily intervene. Biden, as far as I could see, as a US politics specialist, spent 3 or 4 years shredding strategic ambiguity. He wanted to make it as unambiguous as possible that the US would intervene, even going so far as to answer questions by reporters when they were asking him, "Are you talking about direct US intervention?" He would say yes, regardless of how the White House would then try to walk that back. It was very clear he was destroying strategic ambiguity. On the point about is this technology race with China, is the aim to get a better position, get more favorable deals out of China, or is it to debilitate China? Once again, I thought that the Biden administration, it was very clear they wanted to debilitate China. As much as Biden had the rhetoric about China being a competitor, not an enemy, I thought it was very clear, especially with the CHIPS legislation, that he was actually trying to debilitate. Now, it seems on both of these issues, Trump is actually less hawkish. It is not clear at all, as you pointed out, that the United States would militarily defend Taiwan. There are plenty of reasons to think that Trump wouldn't, including things that he had said about his response would be tariffs. Similarly, even though I think he would like the idea of debilitating China technologically, I think he would be more open to dealing on this. So in light of those things, and I mean, this might be a crude and unanswerable question, but do you think that the Beijing leadership in some sense prefers to have Trump there than to have a Harris administration which would be a lot more stable and a lot more predictable, but at the same time continuing very hawkish policies?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I think, for the most part, a lot of the responses from Beijing initially were quite pessimistic. Optimists were sort of few and far between. But I think along the lines of what you're just talking about, that is beginning to shift. Because I think they do see potential of the potential of one of the Trumps as a deal maker. I certainly agree with you on Harris administration. It would have been stable. It still would have been a tough relationship and a relationship that would have been in decline. In terms of Taiwan, my colleague Joe Nye has always made the point that his view was that if conflict was brought about by Taiwan declaring independence, the US would not respond militarily. If it was because of a Chinese invasion, then almost inevitably they would. I'm not sure that holds any longer, to be quite honest. And remember, there's a lot that actually China could do short of invasion to make life on Taiwan unpleasant. They had the joint sword exercises, with the Coast Guard sort of blocking access just to show we can cut you off anytime. And, Taiwan, remember, is something like 90% dependent on import of energy. And because the DPP has been adamantly opposed to the development of nuclear energy, it says it wants to, move to wind, solar, et cetera, but it really hasn't got anywhere to the levels that they were projecting. that's a massive vulnerability. Now, if it was that kind of a squeeze, would the US then respond militarily? I think it's very unclear how that would play out. And yes, I agree with you absolutely 100%. I think that October BIS 22 missive was pretty clear. Yeah, we are here to nobble key parts of your economy. And yes, we say it's all about national security, but those are areas which really would be crippling to the technology of the future, as we talked about before. So bringing it back to your question, I do think leaders in Beijing, despite what I said at the beginning, there's a high degree of predictability. If Harris had won, they might actually like that unpredictability because they feel there might be realms through which they could exploit about whether he would remain as steadfast in terms of strategic ambiguity, which, as you say, yes, Biden, despite what his handler said, totally blew away. But it might be tough for him, given, I know everybody's saying now, Republicans just falling over themselves to do whatever Trump wants, to do whatever Trump says. When we get to the midterms, that might look a very different situation, depending on how those elections go. And Taiwan and the defense of Taiwan might be an issue where many of his advisors and a number of Republicans might balk at giving too much away on that. On the technology side, I think it'll be interesting. As you know, Elon Musk, of course, is trying to get a big data center developed in China. Some of the corporates really find they can do kind of testing in China that they can't do in the United States of America. So yes, again, that might be something that could be more negotiable, as you say.
Thanks very much for that. I think I'll get to some of the questions that are being asked.